वेलकम टू आवर नेशन स्टेट डायलॉग सीरीज राष्ट्र राजदेश संवाद श्रृंखला में आपका स्वागत है. आई एम डॉक्टर गीता कोचर, moderator for today's discussion. Today it's our pleasure to have with us Professor Kerry Brown. He's a professor of Chinese studies and director of the Law Chinese Institute at King's College, London. He's also the president of the Kent Archaeological Society and an affiliate of the Mongolia and Inner Asia Studies unit at Cambridge University. He's the author of almost 20 books on contemporary China and modern Chinese politics. And today we have invited him to discuss his latest book, The Taiwan Story, How a Small Island Will Dictate the Global Future. A very interesting work indeed. And we would want to know more about it because Taiwan is supposed to be very important when we talk about China today. And let's hear from Professor Kerry what is his views. So Professor Kerry, welcome to our show. Can we just begin by you telling us about your book and your work on China in general, and specifically of this book on the Taiwan story? What have you written, and in a brief nutshell, can you just tell us something about your work? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, I've been dealing with China since 1991. I'm currently the professor of Chinese studies and director of the Lao China Institute at King's College, London. I've written about 25 books on China now, all sorts of different books about Chinese contemporary politics, about Xi Jinping, about Britain's relations with China from the very beginning, 450 years ago. This book on Taiwan was something that I wrote in 2024. I visited Taiwan during the presidential election in January 2024. And kind of wrote a book about where Taiwan was, what its history was, that was sort of accessible to as wide an audience as possible. I think that, as you know, many people don't really understand what the status of Taiwan is. They don't necessarily know much about the history, and they probably don't know much about, the people on the island and what their contemporary situation is. So, although I'm not Taiwanese, I mean, I've been there many times, and I first went 25 years ago. And so I thought I would try and write, a kind of account that was accessible about what Taiwan's dilemma and challenges were, and what the, people outside needed to know about this issue, because it's an extremely important issue. It's one that could impact on the rest of the world. And I really felt that trying to write something with as wide an audience as possible would be good. And so Penguin Random House commissioned it. And I'm happy to say now that it's been published in America and Britain, but also, I think, 5 translations. So it's done okay.
Yeah, I mean, I should tell to our audience, it's a wonderful book. Especially, it can be used as a textbook because you will have a complete understanding of the history, the evolution, and the current issues that are, plaguing. And we'll discuss more from Professor Kerry. So, one of the things that really, was striking to me when I started reading about it, and I said, although it's a historical account, and you start with saying something like, and I quote that, when the bloody Chinese Civil War concluded in 1949, 2 China were born. And here itself, I just paused a little and I said, okay, so are you saying at the outset that you see, Republic of China as a part of mainland China, or there is a possibility of the unification processes, or is it that there is only cultural division of a civilization state that you're talking about, And how do you really correlate all of this to what, the Taiwanese leader, especially Chen Shui-bian, is talking about in the sense of one country on each side, Ep45, Qingpang.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reality is that since 1949, there have been 2 entities saying that they were the only China. And so the People's Republic of China in Beijing said that there was only one China and it was the government of that place. And the Republic of China that went to Taiwan said the same, but said that this was only one China run from Taipei. And I mean, so one of the problems is that, of course, diplomatically, every country recognizes only one place. The majority recognize the People's Republic, but still about 12 or 13 small countries or, kind of countries still recognize Taiwan. They then therefore can't recognize Beijing. So, there is an acceptance that there is only one China, at least diplomatically. But the reality is that these two entities are different, are just different. And how we describe that is challenging. But I mean, Taiwan has existed with a political system now, which is a democracy, which is very different to the one in China, and with a majority of people who don't identify as Chinese, or, well, they identify mostly as either Taiwanese or Taiwanese Chinese, but not Chinese. So we just have to have a way of recognizing those contradictions. And that's the difficult thing about this issue, that there's no easy way of saying, okay, there is only one place and these two are squabbling over what that place is. In fact, there are two entities saying that they're the same thing, but increasingly for one of them, Taiwan, it's got more and more people kind of saying, we actually believe that there's really two places and we live in one place and Chinese live in another, and we have to recognize that. Of course, Beijing would not tolerate that at all and would be very, very strong in its response. But the rest of the world has to work out a way of dealing with this when it's not centrally involved in the issue, but would be impacted if that issue went wrong.
I mean, culturally also, I've heard a lot of the Taiwanese saying they're the authentic Chinese because they have preserved the culture, they have preserved the civilization in that sense, which Chinese do not think about. Anyway, I mean, so having said that, as you said, the world will have to recognize or try to comprehend the dilemma that is existing today. One of the major factors in all of this relations that we are looking at is the America, United States of America, which has actually intensified its arms sales to Taiwan. So, do you see a conflict between US and China over Taiwan in near future? And if so, what will be the role of other regional players in your opinion? Because this will become I mean, this is the major issue which most of the countries in this part of the world are really thinking of. Yeah.
So the United States recognizes the People's Republic of China, and it doesn't recognize the Republic of China on Taiwan. However, it made it pretty clear when it shifted diplomatic allegiance from Taiwan to Beijing in 1979 that it would continue to take a close interest in the security situation across the strait. And it passed the Taiwan Relations Act that year. That is not a treaty alliance, but it is, a relatively strong commitment by America to look after the security interests of Taiwan. So America's policy position, which is similar to the policy position of almost every other country, every other major country, is we don't care about how this issue is eventually resolved, either through reunification or two independent states, as long as both sides agree and they deal with it peacefully. So, kind of at the moment, the both sides have disagreed, but they've done it without major military clashes. I mean, in the 50s, there were some clashes. There have been some kind of tensions. They've increased recently, but there's not been a war like there has between Russia and Ukraine, for instance. So, the issue for the United States is, and has always been, it does not want to be instrumentalized by Taiwan or by China to get involved in a war where it doesn't have a direct interest. I mean, it's not its territory. So it's always tried to be ambiguous. Under Chiang Kai-shek, it gave that regime until the 1970s, a lot of support, a lot of aid, but it made it clear that, it would not be dragged into a war just because Chiang Kai-shek's regime wanted to reunify, and take over the rest of the mainland. That policy goal, I think, is largely no longer in place now. But certainly, even under the current leader, William Leiching, there is a desire not to kind of have America dragged into a conflict where, a democratic progressive president, William Leiching, is trying to kind of have America dragged into a conflict where, a democratic progressive president, William Leiching, is trying to kind of have America dragged into a conflict where, a democratic progressive president, William Leiching, is trying to kind of have America dragged into a conflict where, a democratic progressive president, William Leiching, is trying to kind of have America dragged into a conflict where, a democratic progressive president, William Leiching, is trying to kind of have America dragged into a conflict where, a democratic progressive president, William Leiching, is trying to kind of have America dragged into a conflict where, a democratic progressive president, William Leiching, is trying to kind of have America dragged into a conflict where, a democratic progressive president, William Leiching, is trying to kind of have America dragged into a conflict where, a democratic progressive president, William Leiching, is trying to kind of have America dragged into a conflict where, a democratic progressive president, William Leiching, is trying to kind of have America dragged into a conflict where, a democratic progressive president, William Leiching, is trying to kind of have America dragged into a conflict where, a democratic progressive president, William Leiching, is trying to kind of have America dragged into a conflict where, a democratic progressive president, Willi party politician as he is, might want to say, okay, we're independent. And then China immediately responds and there would be a conflict of some sort. So, I mean, this is a big dilemma. The United States is very, very involved. It's the third major party after Taiwan and China. But it's also, the one that has the most to lose if, a conflict happens, which it doesn't agree with and doesn't want to get involved with. It can't stand by and see a fellow democracy attacked, which China, Taiwan became a democracy in 1996. But nor can it just be dragged into a war, which it doesn't want to be, used by others. So, the role of America is still very important. Even today, Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, the American president, had a telephone conversation. Part of it was a response to the comments by the Japanese prime minister about defending Taiwan no matter what, and how angry China is at that. America's response is to still try and balance, but to be very clear that it will not tolerate, an explosion of violence and sort of war created by either side. It wants to see peace. That is harder and harder to maintain. There are possibilities that the balance can't be kept. That's why my book argues that we have to fight for the status quo, because the status quo is no violence, no kind of, major turbulence, even though there are constant tensions, because at least the tensions you can manage, but a breakout of war, you wouldn't manage. You'd lose control very quickly. So that's something we have to avoid at all costs.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, we are not able to deal with Russia, Ukraine for years now, right? I mean, it's going to be out of control in one sense. But, I mean, increasingly what we see are, kind of tensions that are brewing even in the South China Sea, especially between China and the Philippines. And, US is supporting Philippines in all possible ways. And that is really creating a lot of tensions. And recently we just saw the Philippines were bombing, Chinese ships and all of that. So how do you see the matrix of South China Sea will evolve, and what effect it will have on the issue of Taiwan, so to say?
So at the heart of the South China Sea issue is Taiwan, although it involves other disputes with Japan, Philippines, Vietnam, even Indonesia. So I think that the South China Sea issue is China wanting strategic space around its coasts and claiming as much as it can, even though I think if there were a negotiation, it would probably scale back those claims. What it wants is a predictable environment, and the least predictable part of its environment currently is Taiwan, and the possibility of Taiwan, declaring independence in ways that China will have to respond to, or of nationalist sentiment in China getting so strong that it believes the moment has come to launch an attack on Taiwan. Look, I mean, some critics of my book have written that I'm only seeing things from Beijing's point of view, and that Taiwan, has the right to assert its independence. And I do recognize, I mean, I'm not saying if you're a Taiwanese, you should have the right to say who you belong to, and you should have that kind of self-determination. But I'm also aware of the environment, that your words might have a big impact, and you can't ignore that. It's a reality. So that Taiwan is now in this very volatile situation where, the South China Sea involves all sorts of different partners. All of them have very different views, and it could very easily become a scene of massive, massive disagreement and conflict. Well, I can't really see that serving anyone's purposes. It would create enormous economic problems, geopolitical problems. I mean, we would be moving into a world that doesn't exist today. The world today is fractious, difficult, stressed. But if we were to cross the line where China actively had wars with its neighbors and tried to take Taiwan by military force, that's a different world. We don't live in that world, thank God, at the moment. But if we did live in that world, it would not be a similar one to this one. And so I suppose my argument is you've got to kind of try and maintain the sort of predictability and stability you have at the moment, because no alternative is going to really not be very problematic. If China were to retake Taiwan, that would create enormous geopolitical and economic catastrophes, but also 23 million people on Taiwan wouldn't accept that, and there would be perpetual problems. China might win the war, but probably not the peace. But if Taiwan then declares it's independent, China will act, and then we will be in the same position. And if America says, okay, we're going to resolve this in favor of one or the other, that's also a problem. So all of these are very, very hard to engage with as options. The only option that we know works is the one that's in place at the moment, which is ambiguity, not really stating clearly which Taiwan, which China one believes in, having a sort of one China policy, but being ambiguous and vague about it. That's all that really works until one day these solutions may be there may be solutions, but we don't live in that time now. There aren't easy solutions at all. So we just have to wait.
Interesting. So, but the point, let me push you to what you're actually talking about in terms of, Chinese perspective, and your critics have already talked about you looking from the Chinese perspective. I mean, going from that perspective, I mean, many of the scholars opine the objective of President Xi Jinping is reunification of the motherland, right? And in that essence, uniting Taiwan with the mainland, whether by whatever conflict that happens, is the essential objective of President Xi Jinping. So it's also something which many of the people debate in looking at President Xi Jinping's own political legitimacy would continue, and he would remain as the president for life term, provided Taiwan comes back to China. So having said that, how do you assess the situation from that perspective? Because some of the data that has come out is like they are looking at the target of 2027. I mean, at the moment, we are not in that situation, as you're rightly saying, and I can fully agree on to that. But 2027 is not very far if that is what China really wants to do. How do you see that from China's perspective and the mainland China's perspective? Yeah.
Well, I suppose for China, it's hard not to think that this is an historic opportunity, because America is very divided and is probably going to get weaker. So I suppose the pressure in China to take their chance and try and do something is just going to increase. I still think, though, that it would be catastrophic if they did something in 2027, because they may well succeed. I mean, I think it depends what they do, but there are scenarios where they might succeed. But the geopolitics afterwards would be long term. They would fundamentally change the world order, and I don't think China would benefit. No one really would benefit. This wouldn't be a good outcome for anyone. So I think, although people are talking about 2027, it's a psychological war. Because China could do things which weren't an overt attack on Taiwan. It could kind of do a longer embargo. It could do all sorts of things short of attacking the island. But also, I think that China is keen just to maintain the pressure and to stop Taiwan leadership doing anything that might antagonize it. Taiwan's leaders are in an impossible position. I understand that. And I think Taiwan has been lucky in having leaders like Tsai Ing-wen, who, kind of were able to just balance and make sure that they defended Taiwan's legitimate interests, but didn't step over the red lines where it knew China would respond. And I think that there must be some awareness in China too that you have 23 million people in Taiwan, the overwhelming majority of whom were born with no knowledge of the mainland at all. They may have family links there, but they're other generations. There's not direct links. So these are not people with any real kind of attachment to contemporary China. They don't have much sympathy with the Communist Party. They don't particularly like China's politics at all. So you don't want to be fighting with 23 million people. That's not a victory. That's a kind of annexation which will lead to decades of resentment. So I think that it's better for China if it's got a strategy to not do things that would lead to disastrous outcomes for everyone. It's better just to wait. I think for China, it thinks the West is getting weaker and weaker. At some point, Taiwan will probably think, why don't we kind of, have a closer link with our sort of, cultural partners? China and Taiwan, their cultures and their language are very similar, of course. Well, their language is completely similar, but their cultures are very close. Well, that matters, and where kind of America is getting more and more unpredictable and more divided, maybe even kind of becoming almost like a civil war situation. It might be at that time that there's more kind of desire for Taiwan to, have a different situation. We're not at all close to that at the moment, but in 10 years, who knows? I think China shouldn't have deadlines and probably doesn't have deadlines, even if these things give psychological pressure to the outside world. So I'm skeptical of 2027, unless something dramatic happens that makes China want to take that opportunity. I think it will probably look at other options.
I mean, here also we have this opinion that 2027 is not the deadline, but there are viewers which are saying that you know it may not be a outright conflict. It may be, as you said, rightly said, there are other ways in which China will pressurize Taiwan to reunify. But I mean, these are the concerns which everyone is having, and we are looking at how the situation evolves. But let me push you to something which probably is not a part of your book, but is of interest to the this part of the world, that's in India. And here, there are multiple voices over Taiwan. Not that we are outrightly saying that there is not an issue. We know the issue. We do not officially recognize Taiwan's. We don't have a diplomatic mission in the sense as an independent sovereign Taiwan. But there is a consensus that China's power will multiply with this reunification if it happens, maybe in 27, maybe 29, or maybe 30, 35, or whatever. And so, to be the regional leader, China might do certain things as maybe outright attack to take back Taiwan. If that happens, I mean, if I'm talking about a scenario where the reunification actually happens, which you are absolutely right. It would not be very beneficial for China, and there would be a lot of protest within Taiwan. But how do you see from the other angle of it in terms of India? What are the challenges, and in your opinion, how India should react or would react? Because India is also a major power in the region, and it has quite a lot of interest in what happens to its nearby countries. Can you just have an
Yeah.
opinion on that or something? Yeah.
So I think for India, if there were conflict across the strait, firstly, the geopolitics would probably mean that India was pushed much more closely to um, America and Europe. I mean, it would have to make a choice. As a democracy, you can
Mm.
certainly support, kind of China, but I think that would be unlikely. I think that if China was to attack Taiwan, you'd immediately start worrying that it would then start attacking others, and it might get confidence from that. So I don't think it would be in India's interest to be supportive of this. I think it would want to be part of the world that completely condemn this. So I think that India would probably not find its non-alignment kind of position very easy. It would be forced to have a far closer relationship, particularly with America, at a moment, when something like this happened. I think, secondly, it would distort the region because it would mean that China would be then really the dominant power in the region. Negatively, I mean, it would be just be a power that was making it clear that the region is China's, and of course that has implications for India. It would make the competition between India and China much sharper. And I think it would probably create very profound divisions. Um, I mean, I believe that India is very wary of China's military power in any case, but it's been able to balance its relations relatively well under your Prime Minister Modi. But I think that this would be a completely different sort of geopolitical context. And I think finally that for India, kind of this will be a moment where there will be more explicit recognition that India and China are really strategic competitors in the region. They both have different nationalistic visions, and it's not going to be easy to manage those two. This is going to be really the key geopolitical sort of partnership in the next 50 years. The world's two most populous countries, huge economies. These are going to be partners that are definitely going to compete with each other. Maybe they won't have significant issues, but there'll be plenty of challenges they'll need to deal with. And I think that relationship between India and China is going to be probably the defining one of the 21st century eventually, because it's going to be the one between the two newest emerging powers that are going to be more and more dominant.
I mean, absolutely right. I mean, I absolutely agree, because as of now, I mean, when we are talking today, India-China relations are reviving. It's going towards normalization. We are having good people-to-people exchanges, and the relations are going towards an upward trend. But there is a lot of trust deficit, and there's a lot of this notion, as you said, of competition, the regional, leadership position, and everything. It was interesting talking to you, Professor Kerry Brown, and I hope we can continue these dialogues more often than not, because I know that you've done a lot of books, but I wanted to just talk about Taiwan today, especially because of your new book which has come. And for my audience, it's a must-read book if you want to know about Taiwan. It gives a very comprehensive view of Taiwan. And I hope, our viewers who had liked this conversation, they would enjoy much more of this, conversation. And for our viewers, please hit the like icon and subscribe to our channel for more interesting, discussions of this sort. Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much.